We have the very real chance at seeing our first hurricane of the entire year over the next couple of weeks. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the threats that it could bring, who it could bring it to, and at what intensity, all in this 15-minute forecast. So if you guys are excited for this video, make sure to like and subscribe down below. Also, go ahead and share it with a friend if you know anybody out there on the coast. And let's go ahead and get right into this video. But before we do, it is important to note that since this is a bit of a longer forecast, I've got myself a little drink of water here. And periodically, I'm just going to be sipping on that throughout the video. Going to try to limit myself, but, talking for a long time straight. So anyway, getting right into this forecast video here, AL97. That's what we're going to be talking about for the entirety of the video here, not AL96. This could potentially develop into a low-end tropical storm, but it's not going to impact anybody. It's not going to make landfall anywhere, and it's likely not even going to intensify to tropical storm intensity. So we're going to be honing our focus in on AL97 here, also known as Disturbance 1. As you can see here, the National Hurricane Center lists this as a system that has a 50% chance to develop into a tropical storm within the next 7 days, and a 10% chance to do so within the next 48 hours. Now, as I said in the intro, this is something that we're going to be watching over the next couple of weeks, so the fact that it's at a 50% chance in the next 7 days alone is actually quite disturbing. It's not necessarily something that should be giving us a sigh of relief, because we're not expecting it to develop into the next week, and we really never were. Again, this is kind of a 1 to 2 week time frame ahead of time thing, and normally, because of that fact, we wouldn't even be talking about a system like this, but there is so much model confidence and so much agreement across every single model and all of their runs that this is going to be something big that I figured we should talk about it. Going into the Invest 97L model intensity guidance here at the 18Z on Tropical Tidbits, you'll note a couple of interesting things. Number one, there's not a whole lot of models out yet, and number two, it only has this getting up to low-end Category 1 intensity at a maximum. Now, something to note here is, again, this goes out to hour 168, and we're not necessarily expecting this to intensify to its peak within the next 168 hours, so there's a good chance that if this graph went out 200, 240, even 280 hours out, we could see this reach Category 3, 4, some even hitting Category 5 intensity on the model guidance. It doesn't necessarily mean that this system is going to cap at, Category 1 or even just tropical storm intensity. It just means that that's likely not going to happen within the next week or so. So if we take a look back at the 12Z model intensity guidance, you'll notice it's a little bit more bullish here. A lot of the little spaghetti noodles here poking up to kind of low to mid-range Category 3 intensity, and this is whenever we were kind of expecting the system to potentially develop a bit sooner. But this still doesn't go far enough out to account for its peak intensity, even at this point. Hour 168 was never expected to be kind of its maxima in terms of its intensity. All of these models here stop at hour 168 because, unfortunately, it is incredibly difficult to get accurate data outside of that time frame, especially whenever forecasting for something like a hurricane. So whilst we can't see many of these noodles or these spaghetti models or whatever you want to call them go beyond Category 1, 2, or 3 intensity, that doesn't mean they don't have it pushing those limits after hour 168. That is incredibly important to note, because I know plenty of people look at this and they think, oh, it's only going to reach Category 1 intensity, we're fine, what the heck, let's not evacuate, let's not listen to what anybody says about this, and that's how we end up seeing fatalities, injuries, and all the rest in situations like this. So I want to make this clear. This system will very likely hit major hurricane status. Is it a guarantee? Not necessarily, but it is so incredibly likely, and I don't want people to think that worst case scenario we get a Category 1 hurricane out of this, because I know a lot of folks that are not, too interested in weather and they're not in the WX community will look at this, and again, they'll say, oh, it's going to be a Category 1. Okay, no, it's not what that means at all. So I just wanted to make that clear before we carry on here. The GEFS tracks here on the 12Z. This is really interesting. A lot of these are what we would typically call the spaghetti noodles, have this system curving out to sea, not really making impact on the United States. However, you'll notice that there are a good few that do kind of point this towards the United States. And again, this only goes 240 hours out, so it's impossible to see what they have these models doing after that. But if something were to play out where some of these western tracks came to fruition, we would likely be talking about a landfall somewhere near the Carolinas, Florida. But I would like to note, the models, as you're about to see, have had this system all over the place. Anybody that tells you that they know where this system is going to make landfall is lying. I don't care if you're talking to, the Weather Channel itself. If they tell you, oh, yeah, it's going to make landfall near Charlotte, North Carolina, or it's going to make landfall near Boston, or it's going to make landfall near Miami, they are lying. And that is one of the most frustrating parts about forecasting a hurricane this far out, is we genuinely don't know where it is going to make landfall. We can give our best guess, our best estimates, but we don't know. We're just kind of ballparking this here. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a system that is guaranteed to make a landfall in the United States. As I noted earlier, a lot of our spaghetti noodles here have this going out to sea. But I do think that it is incredibly likely that at the very least we see some United States impacts. With the system this big, a lot of these noodles here are getting down to 940 millibars, a couple even getting down to 930 millibars or lower. With a system that big, even if you're 100, 200, sometimes even 300 miles away from land, those surface areas can still experience heavy rainfall. You can even sometimes see tropical tornadoes, gusty winds, and all the rest. So we want to make sure that even if the Invest 97L here does take a similar track to some of these eastern spaghetti noodles, that we're still watching it. Something like this can still affect rip currents greatly. Heavy rain, tropical tornadoes, everything else that we just mentioned, still something to look out for. Now comes the interesting part of the video. So I'm going to kind of yap here for a couple minutes. But before I do, I want to make something incredibly clear. I know we've already stated this, and I know you guys probably understand this at this point, especially if you've been watching hurricane forecasts for a few years, but every model run, whenever you're forecasting 200, 250, 300 hours out, is going to be inaccurate. It is never going to get the situation spot on, and that's why there are so many variations across the models here. And normally, we wouldn't even talk about a system this far out. But there has been a major hurricane painted on every single GFS run that has come out across virtually the last week. So that is why we are talking about this here. Should you take this as, oh, we can forecast 300, 350 hours out now? No. Again, even these models here are not going to get 100% accurate. Otherwise, they would all look the same, and they definitely don't. But you should be able to take away from this, at the very least, that, hey, there is a signal for something big out here. So, with that out of the way, there are several different scenarios that the GFS, the Euro, and the Canadian want to happen with this system over the next several days, and over the next couple of weeks in general. And we're going to try to go through as many as possible. This is the 18Z on August 9th, at the time of filming and the time of uploading most likely as well. This is the latest GFS run and the latest guidance that we have for many of our models on what Invest 97L is going to do. They have this getting down to a 947 millibar low north of the Lesser Antilles around hour 200. Okay, it strengthens even further. We get down to 940 millibars at hour 222 as we get out to August 19th. Just a couple hundred miles off of the coast of the Carolinas. This is what I'm calling the Sandy scenario. Every single state on the coast has been impacted by a major hurricane, or at least a hurricane in general, at some point within the last century or so, and those are going to kind of be our analogs for this event. So whenever I say something like, this is the Sandy scenario, or this is the Harvey scenario, or this is the Lee scenario, that does not mean that that is going to be exactly what goes down, but it is going to be a similar landfall location and a similar track and potentially similar impacts to those systems if those models do come to fruition. So again, this being the Sandy scenario, the reason I call this the Sandy scenario is you have a Category 4 plus hurricane. You get down to 940 millibars. You're kind of bouncing in between mid-range to high-end Category 4, sometimes hitting Category 5 intensity. and then you have it kind of weaken a little bit the further north it goes, and then it makes landfall in southern New England. The model of the GFS that we're looking at right now, the 18Z, has this making landfall at a 959 millibar low pressure system. Now, that would be historic for southern New England, and that is why I think this is the least likely scenario as to what is actually going to come down with this system. And then kind of as it traveling through portions of Atlantic Canada there. We take a look at the total accumulated precipitation. Again, take this all with a grain of salt, but if something like this were to happen, you would be looking at a catastrophic historic scenario where you've got 1 to 2 feet of rain across much of eastern and southeastern New England. Again, I think this is the least likely scenario. I would give this maybe a 0.5% chance of actually coming to fruition. I don't see it staying that strong that far north. I don't even see it turning further west after it already goes that far north. I think that if something like this were to happen, it would go out to sea, for example, or at least a little bit further east into British Columbia. But that is the most recent GFS model guidance. Here is the 6Z run from this morning, and this is what I'm going to be calling the Hurricane Lee scenario. Back in 2023, we had a Category 5 hurricane not make any impacts to land other than in portions of far northern New England and British Columbia. You get this system, you get it down to 942 millibars by August 19th at hour 2:52, even down to 937, 935, 933. Wow, 282 hours out, 933 millibar low pressure system. But even at this intensity, it is too far away from land to make any sort of major impacts on anywhere other than perhaps Bermuda. And then you kind of see this ride with the jet stream, and you watch this really dodge the United States in quite a dramatic fashion. This high pressure is definitely going to help out with that. And you can kind of see it's like, imagine two magnets. You got this high pressure system. Your low here, your hurricane, is going to follow that if this were to play out like this. Now, again, it is impossible to forecast where a high pressure system is going to be located 330 hours out exactly. But if something like this were to happen, this would be most likely the best case scenario that we're going to be talking about today. I also don't think it's super likely. I would give this maybe a 5 to 10% chance of actually occurring. The reason I say that is all of this is dependent on where our high pressure systems line up, what the jet stream looks like, if there's any extra shear, any abundance of shear that we're not expecting to be out here anyway, and those things are just too hard to forecast 300 hours out. So none of these scenarios we can say are, a 50 or a 75% chance of occurring, but I think this one is particularly unlikely. I don't see it necessarily strengthening that far, especially if it goes that far north. Hurricane Lee was in peak hurricane season. SSTs were at a record high, and they are pretty gnarly out here, which is why we're seeing the potential for this system to begin with, but we're still in late August. We're not quite at peak hurricane season yet. The SSTs haven't quite reached their climax, so I don't necessarily see us getting a 933 millibar low pressure system this far north. So that's why I don't think the Hurricane Lee scenario is very likely. Next up, this is one that a lot of people are going to freak out whilst watching. Again, this is a singular run of the GFS, forecasting 300 hours out. But if something like this were to happen, I'm calling this the Irma scenario. You get a 941 millibar low pressure system to make landfall in South Florida. Boom, it rides up the entire peninsula, slabs everybody on the Gulf Coast, then makes its way through Little Rock. This was the 0Z run this morning. Since then, we haven't had a whole, ton of model guidance suggesting that it would go towards the Gulf Coast. If something like this were to happen, this is worst case scenario. We're very, very close to it. Again, you got 2 feet of rain across the entire peninsula of Florida. You've got a foot of rain up towards the lower portions of Alabama. I mean, this is ridiculous. Again, our models haven't wanted this to go towards the Gulf Coast, but if it were to, it would be dependent on high pressure placement. you've got all this high pressure out here. Your system is typically going to favor latitude unless there is another external force pushing it further off to the west. So I don't necessarily think a Gulf landfall is super likely. Again, if this were to happen, this would be worst case scenario. We're close to it. I'd give this perhaps a 10% chance of occurring. Again, that is the Irma scenario. This next outcome is likely the most extreme. This is what I'm calling the Harvey scenario. We have a 946 millibar low pressure system graze the Keys of Florida. We have it get down all the way to 932 millibars through the Gulf, and then make landfall in southeast Texas as a 938. This would be Hurricane Harvey redux. Not only that, this was a very famous piece of imagery across much of WX social media for the past couple of days. 992 millibar low pressure system in the Texas Panhandle. That is borderline Category 1 hurricane intensity in the Texas Panhandle. I personally see this being the second least likely scenario, or potentially even the least likely scenario. I don't see this going towards the Gulf, as I mentioned earlier. I don't see why it would go this far west. I don't see it sustaining hurricane intensity all the way through, like it stays major hurricane intensity all the way through, like, Killeen, Texas. That is not happening. But if something like this were to play out, you'd be looking at, again, a historic, just a beyond historic landfall of Hurricane Harvey proportions. 2 feet of rain across the southeast coast of Texas. You get, half a foot of rain all the way into Perryton, Texas. Like, that, this is kind of ridiculous. Now, those are all the GFS runs. Again, you shouldn't necessarily take the landfall location super seriously, but every single one has a major hurricane developing. Again, can it go out to sea? Yes, and I think that that's somewhat likely. Could it make landfall in New England? Possibly. Could it make landfall in the Carolinas? Sure. Could it make landfall in the Gulf Coast? Possibly. We don't know where it's going to make landfall. And that is why I was hesitant to even make this video in the first place, is because it's basically just 20 minutes of me saying I don't know. But it is worth noting, again, at the very least, that there is a signal for a major hurricane development across somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean over the next 2 weeks. That's your forecast. It's going to happen somewhere. No, but there is a signal for this, and the picture is starting to get clearer and clearer by the day. We're going to have a forecast out for this system either every day or every other day for the next couple of weeks until landfall date, if there is such a landfall. And that is, again, it's going to kind of, we're going to be able to give you more details over time, but that's what we're working with right now with the GFS. Really quickly, I do want to go over the European model and the Canadian. This is the most recent run of the Euro. It kind of has the scenario that I think is the most likely. It has this going out to sea, staying far away from anywhere in the United States, even going east of Bermuda. It does have it getting quite intense, especially considering that this is the European model, and it usually isn't too bullish with the intensity of these storms. 956 millibar low pressure system across portions of the central Atlantic. And then we get over to the Canadian model, which is the least aggressive with this system. But in terms of location, this would be pretty bad. I mean, even if it only does get down to 980 millibars, if it made landfall somewhere near South Florida, obviously that would be catastrophic. So that's the Canadian, that's the European. Again, usually they're not quite as aggressive this far out as the GFS is. The Canadian didn't even have this system until just a couple of days ago. So pretty interesting stuff. Again, peak hurricane season doesn't quite start until around a month from now, actually. Typically, you're going to be looking at around the first or second week of September for the peak hurricane/tropical storm activity. We're right here. We're kind of on the come up here, the first or second week of August. This is where we typically end up seeing the beginning of any sort of hurricane development. You know, we've seen a few tropical storms thus far. Actually, a bit of a deficit in terms of hurricanes. We're a bit behind in terms of first hurricane, but first or second week of August, that's when we're expecting this to, or I guess second or third week of August, that's when we're expecting this to reach hurricane intensity. would line up with our historical analog. So before we end off this video, I do want to quickly thank all of our channel members. You guys are what keeps this channel going. If you don't want to become a member, make sure that you do that by clicking the link down in the description. You get access to exclusive videos, early access to certain videos, shoutouts at the end of every forecast, custom stickers to use in chat, and more. Been lacking on some of the members-only videos recently, I'll be honest, but we're going to try to check out a few more of those for you guys soon. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next one, whenever that is. Stay safe.